Welcome to hashtag 52 Boundaries. And this week we are talking about communication. And I'm so delighted to have with me profiling and communication specialist, Alan Stevens. Hello, Alan.
G'day, Angela. How are you doing?
I am excellent. All the better for seeing you.
Thank you. It's always mutual.
So let's talk about communication. Let's talk about the boundaries between listening and talking. And what we do when we want to fulfill our need to be heard and all of those things that are attached to that. So we're going to follow this model that we've done before, the soft, the rigid, the spongy, and the flexible boundaries. We just want to explore with you the different areas and how all of these boundaries play out in social life and in work, and see how your insights into that are.
Excellent.
So let's talk about soft boundaries around listening and talking.
Right, yeah. Where would you like to start with those?
Well, when does somebody have soft boundaries around listening and talking?
Okay, well, when somebody's in that particular state, allowing all interruptions of all types to be able to come through and control their situation, it comes down to their personalities as well. You'll usually find those people are very much people orientated. They're there for everybody else, but the downside of that is that the end result is that they can become resentful towards the people who have not responded. If somebody else is a bit more rigid in their boundaries and they'd say, right, I want it this way, and they then say, make it softer for that person by just being amenable and pliable all the time. After a while, they'll take resentment towards it, and that can break down the relationships and very quickly fall to pieces.
Well, I'm going to use myself as an example for that because I'm very familiar with that. When I grew up, I had, when I was working in Hong Kong, our company lawyer had some big personal problems. And I've always had an open ear to people because I grew up with this. People just downloaded their problems on me. And so this lawyer would call me and she would literally talk for 2 hours nonstop about her things. And I didn't know how to shut her up. I had absolutely no idea. So I went into therapy and to learn how to deal with her until the therapist said to me, you know what, you need to work on your boundaries first before you can actually start helping her. And that was a big wake up call. But the interesting thing was when I said that when I put boundaries in place, she stopped engaging with me.
And that will always happen because when people's boundaries, we've got two people who've got soft boundaries. Nothing ever gets done. They never make any decisions or anything else. There's always going to be a variation between the people who come together, different boundaries for each one. But you just got to make sure that if you do have those softer boundaries, you do have to make some decisions to make them to make them a little bit more rigid or make them more focused in what you're doing. So as I grew up, similar thing. It was always there to please everybody. And I grew up with, you be seen but not heard, etc. Just be there, do the right thing, etc. And over the years, that did build up resentment towards other people. So I've sort of switched into the next one that I became a lot more rigid in my boundaries. So it was a slingshot from one side to the other very quickly. And that then caused issues as well, because all of a sudden now I became seen to be unfriendly, to be a little bit on the aggressive side. And so you've got to be very careful. You've got to understand your boundaries, understand what triggers them, etc., and then start looking at what really works out the best. How should you be doing this to look after yourself, but you're also looking after the other people as well. And soft boundaries, all we do is look after everybody else, and we don't look after ourselves.
And rigid boundaries then also becomes this whole thing of cutting other people off. I know I did exactly the same thing. I mean, it's this thing is when you suppress a need, and it's basically now where do I have a pen? It's you're stuck in the, like a pendulum, you're stuck in one. And then when you let that go, it swings over to the other side. And all of a sudden that need to overshare becomes, or to cut people off again. Now it's my turn. That becomes then really prevalent. So but it's also, for me, it was, I started sharing a lot about myself. I couldn't stop talking, but people with rigid boundaries often then switch I come from that place of self-protection. And so they don't share anything. So they don't want to listen to other people and they don't want to talk,
That's
right?
it.
It's just pushing things down.
Exactly. See, one of the personality traits that I have is what I call idealism. Everybody's got ideals because they're based on your values and how strong you are aligned to your boundary, your values, how rigid they are will then make your boundaries very rigid as well. And with high ideals, virtually with a couple of other traits I have, I will go down with the ship. If there's something I believe in, it's like to everybody, I don't care what everybody else thinks. I don't care what we should be doing to make it a better situation for everybody. This is the way it should be done. And, it's either my way or the highway. This is the way it's got to be done. And that then causes problems as well, because now you go from having been very soft, everybody saying, oh, you wore your heart on your sleeves, to now being told that, hey, you're withdrawn. What's going on? Why have you pulled away from everybody? So as you said, it's that pendulum swing.
Yeah. And that's the spongy boundaries, is when you, depending on who you're with and what the external circumstances are like, you just swing back and forth between those. And it's just gets very, very confusing, because people never know whether they're going to hit themselves really hard or whether they're going to, I mean, I'm interrupting myself here, but it's this whole, I like this model of marshmallow coated steel. So people who have soft boundaries are just marshmallow. You just sink into that. Somebody who's rigid, that rigid boundaries, they are the ones that have steel coated marshmallow. They are the people that I encounter at work, and they say, you should know me in my personal life. I'm really just a teddy bear. And it's like, yeah, but people hurt themselves when they, bounce off that rigidity, that my way or the highway. And then flexible boundaries is marshmallow coated steel. And again, spongy boundaries, you just never know.
That's right. Well, with spongy boundaries, you got someone who's got those, you can't trust them, because you don't know which way they're going to go. Are they going to be soft one minute? They're going to come back at you with being a bit more rigid in their behavior and their boundaries at that point. So it's a matter of, if you've got into that, because once, as you said, you go from being the really flexible into the very soft, I should say, into the rigid, and then you've got this spongy effect happening. But it's now, as you've said, stepping out, that flexible boundaries, having boundaries that are more these, as you said, marshmallow, steel-coated marshmallows, that you've now got somebody who has got that little bit of flexibility with people, but still keeps their values.
Yeah.
And I think that is a level that when you've gone from the swinging of the pendulum to then being sort of backwards and forwards, stepping out of that, if you want to be happy in yourself, but also connected to other people, where they then value you, they trust you, and they respect you, you need to have those flexible boundaries.
Yeah. And in communication, that is where it matters more than, this is about, what we're talking about is really communicating your boundaries. I know I had a client once, she said to me at one point, she said, when I first met you, I couldn't stand you. And I went, okay. She said, you were always so clear in your communication and your expectations and all of that. And then I realized, and I thought you were just really, very German about it. And then I realized that I always knew where I was up with you. I didn't have to guess whether you were available or unavailable. You would tell me whether you wanted to communicate or not, whether you had time to talk to me or whether you wanted me to listen or whatever it was. And she said, and I transferred that into my work life. And she said, I went from complete overwhelm and people just bound, just because I had an open door policy, to being able to manage myself and my work much more effectively. And so, yay. But she said, I really couldn't stand you.
And I've had a similar thing in my life. Who is a close friend of mine. He had a friend of his, and I ran into his friend one day in the street. This is many, many years after I'd first met him and known him for a while. And he said to me, he said, I just had to point out to you, he said, when I first met you, I didn't like you one little bit. I didn't trust you or anything else. He said, I've been watching you over the years. And there's one thing I've realized about you. You never change. You're consistent. You're always doing the same thing, no matter what else is happening around you. And I realized at that point that I had gone from those, the very soft to the rigid to the spongy to being more to, I realized I was more with the flexible, because I could still talk to him at that point. but still hold my values and my boundaries in that conversation as well.
Yeah. So let's have a look at what do the different boundaries look like, for example, at work. I mean, we've already had the example of, again, when a manager has an open door policy and people just plonk themselves down on their, like I have this a lot with clients who just said, well, how do I do this? If I have an open door policy, I can't tell people not to come in. Yes, you can.
Exactly. So when I look at just on a couple of traits that I work with in that area, there are those bosses who will have the open door policy and they're happy to be interrupted at any time. They're fine with that because it's part of their personality. And it's not one that they get resentful for when people come and interrupt them, because quite often when they're stressed, they like other people to interrupt them to move them away from the stress. But if you've got somebody who's extremely focused on what they do, and when they're working on something themselves, interruptions will really annoy them. So I can say, right, well, you've got to be open to your staff. If you got somebody who you've given a task to who needs some support while they're doing that task, because their personality style is one where they build their confidence, for instance, and if you give them a task, they've got to come up with a new approach to things. They're going to be testing it to make sure they got it right. Questions will come up. They'll then spend a lot of time working that out, or they can come and talk to you. So you've got to be able to do that so you can get the projects done quickly. But in doing that, you set the boundaries up. You tell people that when my door's shut, there is no interruptions. Or if you see me with my head down at the desk and I'm not lifting my head up at all when you're coming, you're walking past my window, for instance, come back later on. Or more importantly, to the person themselves who is that leader, go to the staff, tell everybody you're working on a project, there's no interruptions. You will emerge back out the door when it's okay and that to come and talk to you again. Yeah. So they're setting up boundaries, but they are flexible in a degree. They are not rigid. They're not allowing people just to walk in, so they go very spongy or soft. And you have a better approach to connecting with your staff.
Yeah, absolutely. See, I don't like you. I don't see an issue with people coming in and talking to somebody whose job it is to support others. It is the saying to somebody, please check in with me whether I'm available.
That's it.
Somebody looks really focused and they don't look up when you're hovering in the door. That means they're really focused. When we interrupt somebody who's in flow state, who's really productive, to get attention back to that same kind of state takes 20 minutes.
That's it.
But when somebody comes and taps on there and stands in front of him, there's the constant interruptions all the time. It's really hard to get things done from that place, which is why people like working from home, because they don't have these interruptions. So with Zoom, it's so much more scheduled. It's a little bit more rigid, obviously, but then people flip into Slack mode and then they think that they have to answer Slacks immediately. Again, it's communication that really matters.
Yeah, because this is when, if that leader in that, the head of that team leader or whatever, has the soft boundaries, and if they are a focused person and they had soft boundaries to start with, people come in and interrupt them, it won't be long before they get resentment towards that and they go into rigid boundaries. And then the staff go, what happened? Why don't you like us anymore? And now you'll have loyalty problems and other things coming up. So being aware that letting people, because just because you're busy doesn't mean that other people know you're busy. So you either have ways in which you can indicate it, or the easiest way is just go out and tell them, I'm about to do a project. This one is going to be giving me a lot of thought. It's going to be giving you a bit of a headache. While I'm working on this, I can help you better if you come to me after I've finished this project. So I'm going to go and work on this and I'll come back and tell you when I'm available. Only interrupt me if it's an extreme emergency, life and death type situation. So people still know they can come to you in that balanced way, but at the same time, you've got your space you need.
Yeah, I generally say to people, make it clear to people that they can come to you when buildings are burning, lives have to be saved, or women are saved. Anything else can wait.
Exactly.
So that takes us to the opposite, to the listening, right? Because again, there are a lot of people who don't know how to listen. And so, when we communicate with somebody, it's the ability to say to somebody, look, I like to say, I don't have any attention molecules available at the moment. Can you please, can we please have this conversation a little bit later? But a lot of people think that, especially when they've got soft boundaries, they can they just listen, but they don't really listen. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, because they're just sitting there to take it in because they've got the soft boundaries. They're probably not even connected to things because with the soft boundaries, they've just separated, just moved back from everything.
Yeah.
So they're not going to listen to what's being said. The biggest problem we have with people in conversations is they're usually listening to respond. They're not listening to understand what the person's saying. And so if I look at the spongy boundaries, the rigid boundaries, the soft boundaries, nobody's really connected, not really listening in those states because they're locked into their own way of thinking. But when you're looking at, say, the flexible, for instance, we're now looking at the other person, understanding them, but also knowing our boundaries in that process. So we have to listen to them to know how that fits into our boundaries.
And the important thing is to recognize, again, when we say, you know, like rigid boundaries, when we listen to somebody and we're just putting all their needs ahead of ours on the spongy, it leads to resentment.
That's right.
And when we are aware of how we feel, when that, you know, like either that resentment starts building up, ideally before it starts building up, it's about recognizing what is the other person's need. And then what is our need? And what do we have to balance in order to do that? So if somebody comes in and they have a really strong need to be heard, and we have a need for efficiency at that point, then it's, you know, and getting things done, then it's a question of balancing what matters more at that point. Is it the other person's need to be heard, or is it ours to get things done? And so people say, could you just give me some rules? And I'm like, yeah, that would be great. If I could do that, I would be a billionaire. Right?
Exactly.
But we negotiate boundaries in every single day, in every single situation. We can't really go, you know, boundaries and needs by numbers.
That's it. And so with the rigid boundaries, the person's not even listening to the conversation because they've locked into their boundary issues. The other person's talking. They're not really listening to solutions. They're just going, no, this doesn't fit my my beliefs, my values, my boundaries, and there's no communication there. Then in the soft, they're open, but they're not taking anything in. They're not really listening to it. And in the rigid version, they're again not listening to it. And spongy, well, they're drifting backwards and forwards. And so the game with the flexible, as you said, you're looking at the other person's needs and values, etc., but you're also balancing those with yours. Yeah. And having that more in-depth conversation.
Well, with spongy boundaries, you never know whether the person's going to listen to you or not. Or when, and again, it's this, okay, you've talked enough, now my turn.
Yeah.
This is the whole thing is I find it really hard when I go to people and I say, you know, like do you have 5 minutes to listen to me? I need to, you know, and then they come immediately back with something that they need to share.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, no, you've just basically taken away my whole, what do we call it? It's the recognition of my need.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's all about, and people think that they show empathy that way. If you share something, I share something back, then I've communicated that I understood you. But what it does, it invalidates. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so kids, because this is where we model kids really, really well or really, really badly, right? Or we model for kids, rather.
Yeah, well, when we look at the soft boundaries, again, we've got children who are, they appear to be listening. We're talking at them, not to them. And then we complain later on that they never followed through. They've kept doing the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
And so again, we've got that issue there. But now it's, again, as I always say, you need to understand the other person and talk to them in the way in which they like to be spoken to and explain things in a way in which they can take it in and understand it.
Yeah.
But with children in particular, we've also got to make it interesting so they want to be part of the conversation as well. Whereas, the child with the soft boundaries is just going to go, yeah, okay, sort of thing. We think they're listening, but they're not really listening. If they're rigid, then we're more likely to be having that clash with them right in the middle of the conversation. And nothing worse than having a child who's spongy, who's sort of drifting one way. One moment they're saying one thing and the next moment they're saying something else. It makes it extremely difficult. Yeah. We can't expect the young child to understand the different boundaries. So we have to communicate that and cover that in when we're talking to them in the way in which we interact with them.
So that's the consistency.
That's
so
it.
It's the, when a child, again, it's we're talking age dependent here, and I don't have children, so I always say, like, take what I say with a grain of salt, but then take everything I say with a grain of salt, and what everybody else is saying with a grain of salt. Check what works for you, and then dismiss what insults your soul, right?
That's it, exactly.
So when children come and they really, really want to talk to you, and they're 2 years old, and they then that's a different story. But when you've got an older child, even when they're 3 years old already, my experience is that you can say to them, look, I've got something to do. And if they can read the clock, it's saying to them, when the big hand goes here, then I'll be available to listen to you. But instead of, again, the soft boundaries, it's like, okay, or the spongy, it's like, yeah, I'm doing what I'm doing, but I pretend I'm listening to you. And the child learns that in order to be heard, it just has to keep talking.
That's it.
And what they learn is the longer they talk, they're still not getting anything from the other person, but negative attention even is better than no attention.
Yeah, well, the child will actually find a time that they can get the reaction.
Yeah,
because they're very clever at that. And I always say to parents, how often do your children push you to the edge without pushing you over the edge?
yes,
Because they've read you, they've worked out in what situations they can get a response.
Yep.
And so if you've got that soft boundaries where you don't listen to the child, and the child recognises that, then they'll misbehave. If you have that rigid boundary, then they'll try and fight you, especially if they've got their own rigid boundaries as well, because they're very, what would you call it, very focused on what they're on themselves. And this is part of survival. This is natural for a child to be that way. And then if we're spongy, the kids just go, where's the consistency here? But in the flexible, we have that conversation. We can explain to them what the boundaries are, when we can, at the same time, taking their needs into consideration, have those conversations where they know that we're listening to them, that we and what we share with them, they can then take evaluation of that, as opposed to just fighting it because it's not what they want.
Yeah. So again, it's about modeling. It's walking the talk. It's saying to a child, again, these are it's about identifying behaviors.
Yeah.
And talking to them about, these are the behaviors that we agree on. And so there's the consistency behind that. So children know what's going to happen. There's some sort of predictability. But when it just wobbles back and forth, and children never know whether they're going to be listened to or not, whether they're allowed to talk or not, it gets very, very complicated. And then again, children are selfish in that sense. They want their needs to be taken care of. Of course, they don't know how to take care of them themselves. And differentiating between a need to be heard and a need to be fed is not what they can do at this point.
Yeah, well, that's the thing I keep saying to parents. I fell through this trap as well. I raised 3 boys on my own. The youngest was 4 when I started, and it was even when they were younger and their mother was there, that the children used to say, it's about survival. It's about getting what they want, getting their needs. It's only as they go to school, they're a little bit older, they start to learn how to socialize, but they've still got that battle with the other children who want something that they want, and they can, only one person can have it at the time. But as we get older, we learn more social skills. So with young children, their boundaries are going to be pretty focused on themselves, and they're going to be fairly rigid in that case. But as we grow up, the more that we have that interaction with them as they're growing up, the more that we're able to guide them through. So if we have flexible boundaries towards our children when we're discussing things, we're actually guiding them towards being more flexible as well, and taking them away from the rigid boundaries. And because I know a lot of parents saying, well, you've got to do this, and the way in which they treat the children go from those rigid boundaries to being soft boundaries, feeling resentful and everything else, separate from their parents, pull back from them, so they're not as close to their parents anymore. And then as they grow up, they then learn, well, they slip into the spongy boundaries, where they're going in and out, rigid to soft, etc. And so they're wondering why they're not able to get good relationships as they're growing up. So it comes back to us as adults to be more focused on the flexible boundaries and guiding our children to learn how to create flexible boundaries as well.
And that's the communication. Again, it's about the guidelines. I mean, I talk to people about the fact that when you get into a relationship with anybody, talk about your needs, talk about your boundaries, create the guidelines. Again, it's the communication that matters so much.
Okay.
Like I remember when I first got married, I need alone time. I absolutely need to be by myself, and I read. I read about 2 hours a day minimum. And so when we first moved into a 1-bedroom apartment together, I would withdraw into the bedroom, and my ex-husband would show up, and he would say lovingly, he would say, would you like a cup of tea? Would you like a piece of cheese, and some crackers? And he would just his need to care was just, and care for me was just really overwhelming. I just wanted to be left alone. And again, I started to get really resentful because I just couldn't understand that I needed to be alone. And it was literally sitting down and saying, darling, I really, really appreciate this. When I'm by myself, I need to be by myself. So maybe you could channel your need to care into making dinner or something, but whatever works for you. I just need to have some time where I'm not interrupted every 20 minutes to make sure by somebody who needs to make sure that I'm okay.
See, and those conversations are so important, because if you don't have them, that's when the misunderstandings come, because our boundaries interact with each other. Our values, our love languages, and all the rest of it impact as well. Yeah. It's like two people, one who would just like see overview of information to be able to make a decision. You've got somebody who's more analytical and needs more information. By pre-framing the conversation before it starts, allows those people, if you recognize the other person's personality trait, you then speak to it and you pre-frame the situation, like you've said with your husband. If you had that conversation and said, right, when I go off to read a book, etc., this is the time I have to myself. I just need that space. It's got nothing to do with you. This is just how I get my energies back. And then the partner, because you've had those flexible boundaries in these discussions, they don't take offense to it. Whereas somebody who had rigid boundaries, or the soft boundaries, would take offense to that conversation. So you've really got to work on that from very much in day one in a relationship.
Yeah. So it's instead of going, okay, I'm all right. Yes, please. I would love to have some biscuits. I would love some tea. God, and you just leave me alone too. Don't you see that I'm reading here right now? I really need to be by myself. And, I'm probably not even articulating it like that, but it's probably blaming the other person. Can you just stop caretaking? Can you just leave me alone? And it's about saying, again, maybe not at that time, but it's at a time where the other person, may be more open to it. Because if we're telling somebody, what, your need at the moment to care for me is not really that important. My need to be by myself, it matters much more. It's about saying, okay, I would love a cup of tea. And then maybe finding the time to say, darling, later, I really appreciate you. And could we find a different way of doing this?
That's it, because in the flexible boundary, it's a case of having that conversation and saying, look, I'm going to go off and read for a little while. And one of the things I just need that space. It's what I really enjoy doing. And I love the fact that you care so much by coming and offering the a cup of tea and and biscuits and other things. But when I really love that. But right when I'm reading, this is where my focus is, and this is how I get my energy. And therefore, when I come back to you, I can appreciate you even more again.
Yeah. And it's great when the partner then listens and not immediately says, and by the way, since we're on topic, there's something that you do that really irks me, and let's talk about that. But really understand that at that point, it's the person's need to be heard and to do these things, and then raise it at another time.
That's it. See, and we talk from a place of experience. And so I can virtually say that most of all the stuff we've been talking about today, I wasn't aware earlier on. Hence, 2 marriages and 2 divorces. If I had known what we've been talking about today back then, those relationships or conversations we had would have been completely different. Where the future would have taken us, I've got no idea. I'm happy where I am today because I've learned all this stuff, and I can now share that as we're doing today in this conversation. We can share that with other people so that they don't have to go out and repeat the things that we did.
Exactly. Which is a perfect place to close. Thank you so much, Alan. This has been a great conversation, and I hope that everybody who's watching and listening gets a lot out of it. And again, hopefully avoid some of the mistakes that Alan and I made the hard way and learned the hard way. Thank you, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much. Bye for now.
Bye. Good.
Okay.
that was a very, I think that was a very important conversation.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Excellent. Just hopefully that when my eyes were looking, because I brought the P sheet across, I'm looking at the camera up here. You're over here though.
Yeah, your eyes were drifting down to the down, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Because I think it's all right. I'll want to turn it into a Spotify podcast as well. So
excellent.
Yeah. But that was great. I think it was really clear with the personal examples that we brought and differentiate. I really like the differentiating between the soft, rigid, soft, spongy and hard boundaries and flexible, because it gives people a really clear model of what behaviors are like under the different headings.
That's it. Excellent.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We'll catch you later on then.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Rightio. Bye for now.
Bye.